Delta Airlines started out in 1924 as a crop dusting operation in Macon, Georgia, called the Huff DeLand Dusters. In 1925, Huff DeLand owned one of the largest privately owned fleets in the world, with 18 aircraft consisting of the Stinson Model A. By the year 1929, Delta Airlines operated its first passenger flights with a route from Dallas, Texas to Jackson, Mississippi via Shreveport and Monroe. By the 1930s, Delta would begin its first passenger service to and from Atlanta, which eventually would become home to the airline's biggest and most main hub in the 21st century. By the 1940s, Douglas DC-2 and DC-3 services introduced. Delta moves their headquarters to Atlanta, Georgia from Monroe, Louisiana, and paves the way for Delta to become Atlanta's hometown airline and the largest airline. Flight attendants called stewardesses are also added to the flight crew, and Delta's first converted cargo DC-3 is born. By the 1950s, Delta pioneered the term hub and spoke, scheduled airplanes bringing passengers to a hub airport where passengers are connected to other Delta flights. Delta wins the Atlanta to New York route and identifies both cities as key markets for expansion and hubs. In 1956, Delta installs radar into the noses of each of its aircraft to keep pilots aware of weather, other traffic, and several other factors during flight. They also become the first airline to operate and begin Douglas DC-8 jet service in 1959, cementing the way into the jet era and the new technologically advanced eras to come. By the 1960s, Delta becomes the first airline to launch Convair 880 jet service and the first to fly nonstop from Atlanta to Los Angeles. They also become the first airline to launch Douglas DC-9 service in 1965. By the year 1970, Delta Airlines celebrates 50 years going strong, and more aircraft are being added to the fleet from several different aircraft manufacturers. In that same year, Delta has an all-jet aircraft passenger fleet, and Delta 747 service begins with the introduction of international and transatlantic routes from the U.S. In 1972, Northeast Airline merges with Delta. Delta becomes a major carrier in the New York and Boston markets with direct routes from New York and New England to Florida. Delta also begins operating the 727 aircraft, which was inherited from the merger with Northeast Airlines. In 1973, Delta becomes the first airline to begin Lockheed L-1011 TriStar service. By 1978, Delta becomes the first airline to fly transatlantic from the United States from Atlanta to London. After suffering huge financial losses in 1982, Delta employees raised more than $30 million in payroll deductions to purchase the first Boeing 767-200 aircraft, named the Spirit of Delta. In 1987, Western Airlines merges with Delta, and Delta becomes the fourth largest U.S. carrier and fifth largest world carrier worldwide. In 1990, Delta purchases Pan American Airways and becomes a global carrier, and is also the first airline to offer McDonnell Douglas MD-11 jet service in the U.S. In 1995, Delta creates a low-cost carrier called Delta Express, operating Boeing 737-200 aircraft with service to and from Orlando. The following year, in 1996, Delta is the first airline to board more than 100 million passengers in a year. Delta also begins expansion of U.S. to Latin America routes, and Delta purchases their first Boeing 777 aircraft. In the early 21st century, Delta launched SkyTeam, a global alliance, partnering with Aeromexico, Air France, KLM, and Korean Air. Delta also placed the largest order of regional jets in history, with an order for over 500 aircraft. In 2003, Delta launches Song, a new unique subsidiary low-cost carrier operating only 757s across the United States on transcontinental routes. In 2008, Delta acquires Northwest Airlines, creating a global airline with major operations in every region of the world. The merger also makes Delta Airlines the largest airline in the world. Delta becomes the first U.S. airline to announce onboard Wi-Fi for domestic mainline fleet, and expands codeshare and marketing agreement with Alaska Airlines to increase customer connections through the West Coast. In 2009, Delta celebrates 80 years of passenger service and announces new nonstop flights between Los Angeles and Sydney, Australia, and expanded transatlantic joint venture with Air France KLM. In 2010, Delta announces the largest product upgrade in a decade, with plans to invest more than $2 billion through the year 2013 to improve the overall customer experience, including installing new full flat beds and personal in-seat video on all wide-body aircraft.